I direct the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation. We're going to have a fun day. I want to also say hello to the people watching on the internet now. We're about 100 folks above what we have in the room today. And it's really too bad because New America Foundation almost never feeds anyone. We did yesterday. Today we're doing it again courtesy of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, our partner in today's event, co-sponsor of today's event. I want to say one friend, I'm going to introduce Helga Flores-Trejo in a moment, but one of her staff some years ago, we did an event with Francis Fukuyama and others. It was on State Building. It was kind of cool. But her staff literally went through these kind of traumatic fits because we bought lunches for everybody, box lunches like you have today, but they were all plastic. And you know, these Green Party young apparatchiks said, "Oh my God, all plastic." I said, "Never again." So these are cardboard. But I'm not going to introduce Reinhard Bütikofer. Helga Flores-Trejo, Executive Director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation of North America, is going to do that. Our program today is titled Clash or Cooperation, the Chinese Climate Change Dilemma, a discussion with Germany's Green Party chairman. But I can't not say a few words about Reinhard Bütikofer. In the international political realm, and you know, we all know that I'm sort of toxic with anyone I say I like, and you know, they have to drop their job and change. I remember with Nicholas Burns, the Undersecretary of Political Affairs, the former Undersecretary in the State Department, there was a time when there was an opening in the Deputy Secretary position. But it was very clear to me that anyone I said anything nice about in the administration was instantly tainted as being too liberal or left or rational. And so I wrote a scathing post about Nick Burns, telling the world what a bad guy he was in hope that this would help him become Deputy Secretary. So I don't quite know. He came to me at a reception. Most of my readers didn't understand this, but Nick Burns said, "I know exactly what you were doing, and thank you." But Reinhard Bütikofer is just an outstanding leader. He's a whirling force of nature on the international stage, and I've had the pleasure of knowing and watching him for some years, ever since I was a guest of the Green Party at a party convention in, where were we? Dresden. And it was a fantastic event. We can't go into any of the details because it would be too salacious. But Reinhard is chairman of the Green Party. Helga is going to introduce him. I will say that he is soon standing for the European Parliament in the next election. I plan to be there with my same friends that I was buying beers for, who have control of those little boxes and votes. And I wish him very well. But I want to thank Heinrich Böll Foundation for doing this jointly with us and invite Helga to say a few words.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Of course, I couldn't help but notice that after years you have improved and being very ecologically sensitive. I'm glad about that, and I'm glad you didn't say too much about me. If it's toxic, then it's better for me. Let me just say just one word. As Steve was mentioning, we're very thankful to him. We have done these cooperations in the past. The Heinrich Böll Foundation is a German think tank that works internationally, and Steve mentioned we are close related to the Green Party, working on environmental issues, human rights, and democracy. And the discussion today is important for us. We work also in China, and I think after so many decades of a coal-fueled economic boom in China, you see that the environmental situation in China is in a very grave situation. And the leadership is under tremendous pressure both domestically with unrests and more engagement in environmental issues, and internationally, the pressure for China to do more. I think while we should notice that the grave situation environmentally in China is serious, we should also acknowledge maybe some advancements and just look exactly what China is doing, what's improving. We're working there, and I think you need to have these both messages: grave situation and what are the advancements there, if you want to create some cooperation. So I'm very glad that Reinhard Bütikofer will speak about that today. As Steve mentioned, Reinhard Bütikofer has been a major political figure in Germany for the past decades, actually, as chairman of the party for the last 6 years, but before that, as general secretary, he has led also the coalition in government of the Social Democrats and the Greens, and has had a major impact in foreign policy of Germany in the sense just pushing ahead. So he added to that, he knows China and travels to China with, in the past has traveled to China often. So I think we have a great person to talk about the topic, and with that, Reinhard, I'm very happy to have you here. Please.
Well, thank you, Helga, for your kind introduction. Thank you, Steve, for having me, and thank all of you for showing up. Getting the Chinese on board, China and the global climate crisis, that's the topic that I've been given. For some years, that might sound presumptuous. Getting the Chinese on board seems to signal that we can be sure that we have enough leverage to move the Chinese. Is that really true? China is, as we all know now, the principal emitter of CO2 in the world by sheer quantity. But then it might be presumptuous on a second level too. Are we sure that all of us are in the same boat to begin with? If we are in the same boat with regard to climate, are we rowing in the same direction or even at the same beat? And third question that you would hear often when you start talking about China and the climate crisis in Europe, wouldn't it be wiser to find common ground between the United States and Europe first, and then turn to China and tell them what they might do? Wouldn't it be better to show a sense of unity within the West and to give an example and lead by example on the part of the West? I have to admit that even though this is a popular view in Europe and in Germany too, I believe it's idealistic. Europe has to go extra miles to convince the US to share our efforts, and we cannot do that unless we describe a way to get Chinese on board. Clearly, and I think this is a proven fact, the US is not going to move as much as we want this country to move in the direction of mitigation and adaptation unless we make sure that there is going to be a formula that includes China and other countries like India or Brazil or Russia too. I think we should start out in that effort from a basis that is being described by the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Under that principle, China at the Bali conference has accepted a principal obligation to contribute in a substantial, measurable, and verifiable way. Now, clearly that does not mean that it would be practical or even for that purpose just to demand that they shoulder the same level of obligation or contribution on their part, or for that purpose India or Brazil shoulder the same level of obligation as we expect from industrialized countries. If you just look at the figures, I think this is more than obvious. Right now, per capita, CO2 emissions are ranging between 8 and 9 tons per person and year in Europe. Germany is above that average with about 10 tons. The United States is at about 19, India is at about 2, and China ranging between 4 and 5. The goal that we have to go for would be at least that's the position from which I am arguing, to reduce climate change, which we cannot altogether avoid, to an increase of not more than plus 2% centigrades. And that would demand that the global CO2 emission should peak by 2020 at the latest, and that global CO2 emissions be cut by half by 2050. Now, if you look at some of the graphs that have been developed by scientists to describe that huge task, it becomes quite obvious that such goals leave very little, dearly little room for the developing countries or the threshold economies to emit more. They can peak later than the West, but if we should attain those goals, they cannot peak much later than 2020. So that clearly gives us a very difficult task. We have to convince these countries, and I will focus on China as promised, that they can go on with a sustainable strategy of development without ruining their and our climate at the same time. And we have to convince them that they have to take a greater obligation than they have so far. Now, clearly, there is much more, has been much more effort on the side of the West, on the part of the West, to explain that very general principle than to offer practical strategies to convince them. There would be a need, I argue, for some graduation process, which means that developing countries or threshold economies, as they go along, have to take an increasingly greater responsibility. Now, the Bill Foundation, together with a couple of other NGOs, has put forward a very interesting proposal to that effect, which has been called the greenhouse development rights. This is a concept which I will not explain in detail, but basically it's a concept that starts from a very practical point of view. You have some 80 million wealthy Germans responsible for a good deal of CO2 emissions. In China, you also have some 80 million wealthy Chinese responsible for roughly the same amount of CO2 emissions. But if you go to the national statistics, of course, this is sort of diluted by the fact that you have more than 1 billion poor Chinese that emit very little. But shouldn't the wealthy Chinese or Indians also contribute? I think this would be a fair demand. So the greenhouse development right strategy tries to measure first the contribution of different countries in the past to the problem, then their ability to participate in the solution, and then to measure the degree to which they should contribute. And it basically assumes that up to a certain level, CO2 emissions are unavoidable to make sure that people can develop to a minimum level of wealth just above the poverty line. Those CO2 emissions should not be counted against them. But above that, they should start carrying part of the burden. I think this is just one idea, but we would have to focus, this is my first point, we should focus much more on developing such strategies of graduation, of gradually taking a bigger part of the burden. Now, clearly, when we do that, we have to ascertain that we understand well why the growth perspective for China is not a matter of choice. It's a matter of necessity. They don't have to listen to voters, of course, but Chinese peasants are famous for organizing a little revolution once in a while if they get too disgruntled. And nobody knows that better than the Chinese communists. And the question of social and economic and political stability is exactly the point where environment and climate comes in. When the Chinese President Hu Jintao presented his strategy at the 17th Party Conference last year, he talked a lot about what he calls the harmonious society. Now, that might sound silly to Western ears. I think what he tried to explain is that the Chinese are bound to develop a strategy to manage the conflict potential that is there quite visibly by enhancing social inclusiveness and taking on the environmental challenges. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has calculated the impact of environmental degradation on the Chinese society. They come up with very threatening figures. According to their calculation, the environmental damage adds up to 10% of national GDP per year, which basically makes it as large as the growth rate. Now, of course, this is a theoretical observation because nobody's paying for all that damage at that given point in time. But that's not making the problem any easier because they are kind of putting off what I would call environmental debt for the future to pay, and that usually makes it much more expensive. So the leadership there has to be on the search for new development models. And I'm part of a binational group called the Chinese-German Dialogue Forum, where they last year in our last meeting explicitly said that they want to develop a new development model because the one that they have been following for the last 20 years has done them good services in creating an economic progress that has not been experienced anywhere else in the world ever, but it has also landed them in deep trouble with regard to social disparity and also environmental problems. So I would argue that the Chinese, and this is important to have in mind, the Chinese have their own extremely good reasons to do something about climate change. And it can be described in very graphic examples. For instance, the damage caused by intense cyclones in China has risen significantly. Annual rain has declined in the past decade in Northeast and North China, whereas it has increased a lot in Western China, leading to a lot of floods, an increasing number of floods since the 50s along the Yangtze. The frequency of extreme rains is still rising. The increase of dust storms is considerable, and the expansion of areas affected is very large. There's an increase in the territory affected by drought. But this is just what we have experienced or what the Chinese have experienced so far. If you calculate a possible effect of ongoing climate change, it'll get a lot worse. The production of rice and corn and wheat is expected to drop by about 10% by 2030 and to up to 37% during the second half of the century. The river systems of northern China could rapidly turn into an ecological crisis and an outright social and economic disaster. One of two rural poors live in an area affected by climate change. So if this would not be checked, there could well be sudden spikes in rural to urban migration levels in China, destabilizing the whole country. If you look at other aspects, for instance, the glaciers of Qinghai Tibet Plateau are retreating at a dramatic rate of 130 square kilometers annually. The permafrost soil in Tibet is getting a lot thinner. The rate of desertification is increasing. The economic centers in coastal zones in China, which are the most important economic centers of the country, are particularly at risk to climate-related hazards. The IPCC's fourth assessment report anticipates up to 60 centimeters of sea level rise. Well, if the ice cap or a considerable part of the ice cap of Greenland would melt, that you wouldn't count in the centimeters, you would count in the meters. Shanghai, for instance, is located at an elevation of only 4 meters above sea level. So any considerable change would soon result in great damage caused by summer typhoons, storm surges, and excessive river runoffs. One very graphic example from last year was the snowstorms. The worst snowstorm last year in half a century did not only claim lives, it affected over 11 million hectares of cropland and destroyed 1/10 of China's forests. The destruction was measured in as amounting to up to more than $20 billion. So I think the argument that the Chinese have good reason to move on climate change is a valid argument. And I guess the first thing that we can do about that is sharing research and science and information with them to inform them as best we can about possible consequences of what is going on. A more important strategy, from my point of view, is to raise energy efficiency. Between 1980 and 2000, GDP has quadrupled in China, whereas energy consumption has only doubled. From an energy efficiency point of view, that's a good result. Unfortunately, that tendency has been reversed over the last 8 years, partially because the Chinese have moved much more into heavy industries. So even though all the sectors of industry are still increasing their efficiency to a small degree, the overall energy efficiency of the economy is not getting better. One important consequence that the Chinese leadership has drawn from that experience is that in the 11th five-year plan that is underway right now, for the first time ever, they have prioritized energy efficiency as a prerequisite target. And their goal is to reduce energy efficiency per unit of the GDP, to increase energy efficiency per unit GDP by 20% in the year 2010 as compared to 2005, which is, I think, extremely ambitious. Within the first year, they have not succeeded. I guess that if we take that seriously, a second strategy that we would have to pursue would be to get involved very deeply into technology transfer. Now, I know this is a hard sell, particularly in a country that already has a broad-ranging discussion over wealth, funds, wealthy funds in China buying up this or that. And it's not an easy sell in Germany too. But I have experienced at the Bali conference that the Chinese are moving in a direction which I think is rather realistic. They're not demanding that the world buys new technology for them and gives up on intellectual property rights. They're rather moving in the direction of trying to organize a platform within the UN framework, which is a public platform, but which would be used to facilitate business-to-business cooperation with regard to technology transfer. And I think this is a very important point, and we should be very active to move that ahead. And one technology that is not on the market yet, but which would be extremely important from my point of view, if it succeeded, would be CCS, which is carbon capture and storage, because the vast amount of energy source that is used in China is, of course, coal. And without CCS, it will be extremely hard, if not impossible, for the Chinese to attain energy efficiency goals that are worthwhile. We should note, however, also that part of the increase of CO2 emissions in China are caused by economic decisions that we are taking in the West. The process of offshoring and outsourcing plays a role there, and the demand of Western customers. So about 25% of the overall CO2 emissions in China are not for Chinese consumption, but are an effect of the net export from China. Third point. My impression is that whereas the Chinese leadership has really understood the problem, the real challenge is administering solutions. There is no cohesive energy policy in China, as there is no single institution responsible for that. Energy policy institutions are manifold, fragmented, and involved in numerous power struggles. And still increasing on that problem is the fact that lower levels of administration are very hard to control by the center. So at the regional level, or even more so on the local level, it is very hard to get national policies implemented. Just to give you one example, the national building code that they do have in China, I don't know what it is, but that's the number I've read in a report. The national building code is implemented only for 4% of all the buildings in the nation. So implementation and administering implementation is a huge challenge. The Chinese do have a national climate change program. I think not all countries do have that. They have guiding principles that sound interesting. But whatever the principles are, and I will not cite them right now, the problem is that principles don't necessarily and automatically produce action. So implementation is weak, I think, on two counts. First, that they do not use as much as they could and should economic instruments, like emissions trading, for instance. There have been pilot projects, part of them with the help of the EPA, but it has not gotten any relevant strategic attention from the leadership level. On the other side, regional and local leaders, as I said, are an impediment. Now, it's hard from the outside to influence that, but still there are some options. I know, for instance, that the state of Maryland has a kind of twinning relationship with a Chinese province, and I guess other states have similar relationships. I do know that German states or similar regional institutions throughout Europe have such relationships. I think it would be worthwhile to try to use those relationships to transport administrative experience that we have and share that with the Chinese. One last point that I want to emphasize, which might surprise you, is democracy. There is a myth that without democracy, it might even be easier to get things accomplished. For instance, in Germany, there's this myth about Commander Wu in Shanghai, the guy who organized the building of the magnificent maglev ultra-high-speed line between Shanghai Airport and Shanghai. He didn't give a damn for citizens' rights, property rights, participatory democracy, nothing. He just had orders and pulled that through in a very short period of time. And a lot of people, including the former Chancellor Schröder, admired him a lot for that. When it comes to one maglev line, it might work. But when it comes to the broader task of getting involved a whole people to change their mode of production and consumption and do all the numerous things that you have to do to change, you cannot succeed without an active participatory democracy, without civil society playing a role. Because you need civil society, for instance, as a means to check corruption, as a means to check local obstruction. And interestingly enough, the field of environmental policy is one field where the Chinese authorities are willing to experiment more than in other segments of society with forms, little forms of participatory democracy. For instance, I read a very interesting story. Chinese NGOs organized a campaign, was called the 26 degrees centigrades campaign. They called on embassies and companies and other institutions to oblige themselves to not put their air condition lower than 26 degrees centigrade. They were successful to some degrees, and 2 years later, the government made a regulation out of that. So there have been examples when the government used NGOs and civic participation to try to experience what way you could be successful. And I think they would have to move much more in that direction to really get participation. Now, one thing I have completely excluded in my presentation here, I know, I have not spent a word on the Chinese attempt to get at our oil resources under the Arabs' lands. And I do know that this competition over dear and scarce energy resources is a reason for concern, not only in the United States, also in Europe. But I didn't want to delve too much into that and to concentrate on that, because my core message is that what we need is a lot more of constructive engagement with the Chinese if we want them to carry part of the burden. It will remain a huge challenge. Let me give you this number. Even if China can limit carbon intensity at half of economic growth, a quadrupling of GDP over the next 20 years, which is quite probable, would lead to an increase of the emissions to an extent where these emissions from China would equal 50% of global emissions today. So it's a tall order. To sum it up, I would argue we have to share science and research, we have to share technology, we have to share administrative experience and economic instruments, and we have to share democratic experience if we want the Chinese to share the burden and if we want to be successful in making sure that we have a common future. Thank you.
Thank you. take questions. Reinhard, thank you. I'm going to open the floor to questions, but let me open up here, and we're going to have you talking to the mic here so that we stay online with the internet people. This is my voice, internet people, since they can't see me, they can only see you. I do want to open the floor, and Sam's going to bring the microphone around, but as we think about that, let me pose one question. I'm off to China on Saturday. Be in Beijing for 5 or 6 days, and I always worry about that quality of the air and all the pollution side of this. But on the energy front, it sounds as if you're struggling both with a kind of cautious optimism and a pretty profound skepticism about the task at hand and how to get there. A week and a half ago, some of my colleagues and I were at Google out in California, their headquarters, and it's fascinating to see what this search company is doing in energy. People don't realize that a lot of big companies, Microsoft and others involved, are looking at the question of the sort of next generation of vehicles and how to move into renewables in some sort of practical and sort of large-scale way. But what they really said is they discussed China, and they said, the big challenge for all of us is to find an energy source cheaper than coal. If you don't find an energy source cheaper and more practically usable and deployable than oil or than coal, this fundamentally isn't going to work. And I'd be interested in how you think of that as well. Do you think that the challenge that we all need to be focused on with regard to China and even the United States and others with great coal reserves and whatnot is that unless we come up with some major strategy to deliver a major energy source that you can deploy through your economy that is less expensive than coal, then this fundamentally is a lot of sound and fury, but not going to have the impact you hope for?
I agree with your assumption. Here are the numbers. Right now, small water power, which is a renewable resource, is 1.2 times as costly as coal in China. Wind is 1.7 times as costly. Biomass as a source for electric power is 1.5, and photovoltaics is 11 to 18 times as costly as coal. If that cost cannot be reduced to make renewable resources more economical, there is no solution. But is it an impossible challenge? I don't think so. And the Chinese market has a huge capacity. And we have shown in Germany that if you really endeavor to develop a market for renewable energies, you can greatly bring down the cost. That's the great success of the feed-in law that we have initiated. And I think when we can do that, they can do it too on a much broader basis. And if you go to the numbers, they're interesting. The Chinese are promising to have 300 gigawatt of hydropower by 2030, I think. 300 out of a potential of 540, which is quite ambitious. They are so far going for 30 gigawatts wind power by 2030, even though they have a potential of 1,000 gigawatt, 300 onshore and 700 offshore. So if they can make wind more economical, and if they can, or if we together can help solving the problem of storage, which of course is a problem for renewable energies, then there is an alternative. There can be an alternative for coal.
Great. Let me open the floor. Yes, ma'am. And if you will identify yourself, and there are going to be a lot of questions, so ask your one question of the three you might like to pose. That'd be great. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, just one.
Hi, thanks. My name is Lisa Friedman. I'm a reporter with Climate Wire, and I was hoping that you could talk about your thoughts on carbon tariff. The Lieberman-Warner bill included a carbon tariff, and while it died, the conventional wisdom here, I think, is that any U.S. bill that passes will include some kind of carbon tax or tariff. What do you think the implications will be? Is it an effective tool in getting China to move forward or not?
Terrific. Thank you.
I'm all in favor of a carbon tariff. We have it in our country. For the Chinese, it's still a tough challenge because in the past they have been subsidizing gasoline, for instance, and they have just seen themselves in a position where they were forced to reduce that subsidy. That's a first step.
By 18%.
That's a first step in the right direction, but it's still some way to go.
Did you have a comment?
No, I think she means the carbon tariff for products from China coming into the U.S.
Oh, I see.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm not
Is
in
that
fa-
what you meant? Oh, perfect. Okay, great.
Oh, I'm not in favor of that. That's been sorry for misunderstanding.
It's good to get it right for the reporters.
There has been a discussion to that extent within the European Parliament too, and the French, for instance, are always fond of tariffs, so they use the opportunity
Now,
of
there's a quotable line.
proposing a new carbon tariff or green tariff. I think it would only end up in a war within the WTO, and I don't think it would be to the advantage of anybody if we would allow people to use the necessity to have more energy efficiency as a pretext for creating new tariffs.
No, right here and then right here. Yes?
Can you say a little bit
Can you
about...
identify yourself, please?
Oh, sorry. I'm Jenna Goodward from the World Resources Institute. Can you maybe talk a little bit about China's plans with regards to CCS, how you see that fitting into their proposed platform, and any potential EU cooperation on that?
Well, I'm not aware of a specific plan for the use of CCS in China. You may know more than I do about that. I know that within the EU, we're going to have 12 pilot projects financed by the EU budget over the next couple of years to develop different technologies and to gather some experience. And I think it's quite clear that the EU is more than willing to share this technology with the Chinese because, of course, as they are set to focus on coal, that would be a possible answer. I am, however, not convinced that this would be the economically most viable solution. As far as I know, if you use CCS technology, the efficiency would be reduced by 10 points. So if your coal power plant, let's say, is very modern, it would run at 46% primary energy input efficiency. That means if you put CCS on top of that, it's reduced to a mere 36. That's one problem. And the other problem is that this technology so far is expected to be extremely expensive. So I would endeavor to try to find out whether it can work, but I've met quite a couple of people from the business community who were more than cautious about that and warned about too high expectations. And if the price of wind can be brought down considerably, it might be the more economical solution.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Yingling Liu with World Watch Institute, and I would like to add a very quick observation to this latest question, and then have my own short question.
As long as it's a really quick observation.
Very quick,
Okay.
very quick. And about the carbon tariff, you might have, I think you should know that the Chinese government has already increased the export tariff on all those energy-consuming products. And so I would argue for another carbon tariff in the US or in Europe. So this will help the Chinese government to reshape or restructure the economy very quickly. And my question is, I agree with you totally that it is very important to engage China. But the question is, I think that it's also very important for to engage all the other countries like the US and Europe on the ground, like in the interest of the Earth. And just explain your stance. I mean, you don't approach this from a rich country's perspective. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of the Earth, that some of the policies in those countries are not so conducive. Just give you an example. One of the very good technologies developed in China, like the energy efficiency bulbs, And those companies cannot expand their products in Europe because there are trade barriers spearheaded by very strong international companies.
You got to cut it off there.
Well,
comment?
I was more polite here than I was in an earlier discussion at the State Department. There, I flatly pointed out that as the Chinese have a national climate change program, the United States don't. I didn't want to confront you all here in public, but if you challenge me to say it, yes, I think there is a role to play for particularly the industrialized countries. And yes, I do think that the Chinese made a couple of steps forward at the Bali conference, whereas some other countries were too reluctant to move forward as they should have. For instance, I do recall that a year before Bali, the head of the Chinese delegation announced that the Chinese would not consider reducing CO2 emissions before the year 2080. At Bali, they took a completely different position and accepted that there should be measurable and verifiable contributions. On the other side, it's part of the language of the Bali mandate that even industrialized countries can avoid the obligations that they accept if they explain that in a language of national considerations, which I think is not acceptable from a global point of view. So I think that not only technologically, but from the measure of the contribution, those countries who contributed most to the problem should also contribute most to the solution of the problem, clearly.
Thank you. In the very back?
Yes, I would like you to...
You identify yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Patrick Glemo. I'm from Canada. We're part of a group of Canadians who are here as a guest of the State Department and discussing about climate change and energy security, actually. And there was an article this morning in the Washington Post. I would like to know if you have any comment on it. It's regarding the Copenhagen Consensus Project that basically said that the cap and trade and the Kyoto Protocol, there's a challenge, and it could be a failure if we not focus on R&D, research and development on low carbon emitting energy. If you have any comments on that.
Thank you. And to the gentleman right next, we'll give him after your response.
We have to focus on low carbon. Agreed. But if low carbon means nuclear, I'm opposed. I don't know whether we want to go into this, but...
How do you not go into it? For instance, the United States, you know, you always get in trouble with off-the-record forums, but damn it. I was at the White House, and let me just say, Vice President Cheney made two interesting comments. He gave a Reinhard Bütikofer sounding like comment about the importance of moving forward on climate change strategies. Then he's had two pieces.
No, you're killing me.
Yeah, no, well, this part will save you. This is the boy to save you. The other part that he said was really remarkable is that when it came to thinking these through, one was massive expansion of nuclear capacity. It's the only way, and one gentleman I won't refer to because I sort of like him, but nonetheless said any climate change activist that doesn't take nuclear seriously is silly. That's pretty much a direct quote. The second bit of it was that about offshore oil drilling, you know, about an issue that I'm somehow, I'd like to say ambivalent, but getting back to the coal issue, it's very, very hard to blame China for running to coal if in fact we're running to the cheapest sort of next sort of unregulated sector with offshore oil drilling. And I do worry about this new dimension with 74% of Americans who are seeing high oil prices saying, okay, now we don't have to worry about the environment or our various concerns and run to offshore oil drilling. So if you could expand on that, and then we'll get to this gentleman right back here.
I'll take the Chinese example. As I said, they want to have 300 megawatt hydropower by 2030. They want to have 60 megawatt of renewables. They want to have 40 megawatt of nuclear. Some of the studies that I read question whether that's attainable. I asked the Chinese ambassador in Germany why they're so modest, quote unquote, on the nuclear side, and he said it's too expensive. And I would give you two general arguments, one from an economic angle and one from a security angle. Studies that I've been informed about argue that the supply of uranium is decreasing not as fast, not at the same speed, but as the supply of oil is too. Peak uranium is supposed to be off some 60 years. Now make it 100 to be less controversial. This is calculated on the basis of the 437 nuclear power plants that we have throughout the world. Now, surprisingly, the IEA in Paris, that was continuously wrong with their predictions on oil, have come out with a new calculation that the world needs 1,300 additional nuclear power plants. Now just look at this from a supply point of view. How long is the supply of uranium going to be sufficient if we triple the amount of plants? From an economic point of view, I change to the security point of view. There are 5 security considerations which, in my mind, are strong arguments against nuclear. One is operation. We argue we have the safest nuclear plants in Europe. That's what the Swedes say, what the Germans say, what the French say. That one accident in the recent accident in the Swedish nuclear plant in southern Sweden just narrowly avoided a meltdown. We're happy it didn't happen, but nobody knows even now why it didn't happen. This is the risk of operation. The risk of transport, I don't have to explain. The risk of storage is interesting. We have a research facility in Germany called ASSE, where they store medium level and low level nuclear waste as a research project in salt. Now this is the most public present scandal in the country, because what should have been safe for centuries is already unsafe today. And the same kind of technical solution was the proposal for the overall high-level nuclear waste that is being produced in our country. So, as far as I know, no country has solved the problem of nuclear waste storage. The Russians are in a particularly interesting situation. They have storage facilities not beyond, not below the ground, but above the ground, in permafrost regions. Now that climate change is hitting at them too, all of a sudden all that infrastructure is becoming unsafe. I hope they will manage. A fourth problem, terrorism. We know that terrorists have schemed to attack nuclear facilities. Now I tell you what the German security concept has been in the past. We want to create a fog around the nuclear plant, just lasting long enough for the Air Force to come in and shoot down attacking planes, for instance. And there are several reactors that are not even safe against military planes, not to speak about civilian planes. Now, the Supreme Court has struck down that law that would have enabled the government to order such an attack. We don't have a security concept right now. And fourth is proliferation. If you talk about 1,300 nuclear plants, they're not all going to be built in the United States and France and Sweden and Germany and Italy or whatever. They're going to be built in a good number of countries where you don't have the necessary level of governance, probably. And then talk about proliferation. And if you combine that with the problem of scarce uranium resources, you can solve that too. You can go into how you call it? Yeah, I'm just missing the word. Reprocessing the fuel. Now, if you do that, you will end up with 30 cases of Iranian dimensions. I don't think this is a good strategy.
Yes, sir. Very back.
Hi, Shao from the Chinese Embassy. I've got a question. Just last week, China and the United States signed a major agreement that is a 10-year framework for the cooperation in environment and energy. And according to you, in the next 10 years, what would you see as the major fields of clashes or cooperation in this field between China and the United States?
I expect more cooperation than confrontation.
Yeah, good. Right here. Actually, since you're going here, let's go to this nice lady here and then here.
Doris E. Clay, CMC Energy Services. I want to get back to what is the cheaper type of energy and its energy efficiency. And specifically, we have been working in trying to get America's stock of older homes up to today's codes. Now, apparently, if only 4% are up to code, you've got 96% who would be into that. We have found that, on average, you can reduce the energy used by efficiency, and I'm not talking anything tomorrow. All these are things available today at good prices. Save money in the sense that it will cost you less each month if you finance it, then you will save. In other words, you're paying as you save. And we have an average of 25% reduction. This has been...
We have a lot of questions and whatnot, so I'm going to ask you to make it a question real quick because we've got to move with the others.
Is this something that you feel we could successfully introduce in China?
I think we can. I can give you, can add to your question by giving you the German example. We are using 80% of the gas that we import from Russia to heat our homes. About 50% of that is wasted. Today, on
Germany, it's wasted?
In Germany,
Yeah.
50% roughly. Today, you have
I thought you guys were good.
Well,
I mean,
we
you were
have
good.
been, to be honest, we have been better in increasing the production of renewable energies than we have been in increasing energy efficiency. We're lacking there, and particularly in the building sector. And the present standard for old flats, not individual houses, old flats that you rent, is a consumption of between 200 and 300 kilowatt hours per square meter and year. Now, an attainable standard, which is the passive house standard, would be below 15 kilowatt hours per square meter and year. This has been done, and I could even show that it can be easily financed by private investment if you do the right regulation. So there's a clear disparity between opportunities that we have and, of course, what we do.
Yes, right here.
In reference to the
You'll identify yourself, please.
Ryan Covington, Atlantic Council. In reference to the contrast between your remarks on long-term plans, such as the 2020 peak point or 2050 goal of half the level of current emissions, and in contrast with the immediate problems such as soaring food prices due to food shortages, why does the EU or European nations individually not push further for immediate change through their economically backed soft power, in particular pushing more strongly for, if not carbon trading or carbon taxation, certain business restrictions that could create some kind of change or immediate impact?
Did you follow that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. Can you get right down to the nugget of what you want to know?
All right, since these are all long-term goals that you laid out, in particular 20, 30, 40, 50 years
Got
down
that.
the line, and there's immediate problems such as food
Just
shortages.
what's the question?
Why is there not immediate change being done, and why are you not focusing on the immediate future and rather than later 50 years down the line?
Great.
Well, I wouldn't accept that this is a fair representation of my position. We do need to have long-term goals, but we have short-term goals too. And we're pushing very strongly in favor of, let's say, cap and trade system. We have a European cap and trade system. It didn't work that well during the first period. We share all the fallacies with you. You can do better if you try. Learning from our experience, we have advocated auctioning off 100% of the CO2 emissions certificates that go into the electricity producing sector. This is a present day controversy within the European Union, and we are strongly pushing for a very earnest effort there.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for speaking today. My name is Claire Sorowski, and I'm a Princeton graduate student, and I'm working with environmental defense this summer. And I just wanted to ask more about looking to a global climate system. You talked about China being willing to do things like technology transfer, but if the U.S. were to sign on and join in a global kind of cap and trade system, what do you see as the chances for China and some of the other emerging economies to also sign on to some kind of program like growth budgets or sectoral approaches that would also be capped generally?
So other approaches other than cap and trade? Or cap and trade
Actually,
plus?
Cap and trade plus.
Okay. I question, do you really think China's going to go to cap and trade?
Not in the next 10 years. I don't see that. But I can't explain the specific negotiating strategy of the Chinese side. I'm sorry, but I got the impression that there are two motivations, at least for them, that we can build on. One is the side of the destructive impact that I've described a little. And the other one is that they want to be at the helm of innovative economic progress. The Chinese are not content with having last year's technology or last decade's technology. They want to move ahead. If you go, if you just watch what's happened in the sector of photovoltaics, few years ago, everybody I talked to in the German solar industry told me solar cells from China are not up to standard. They're below standard. Today, a completely different picture. The Chinese are up to standard, and they are competitive with their solar cells. So they really want to push forward because they know it's more costly to have less effective technology. And as they have to combine two efforts to reduce the environmental impact and to increase economic progress, what better way could there be than to endeavor in that direction? So I think that the Chinese, look, when the Stern report had an impact in Europe, the Stern review, sorry, in 2006, we were very, very grateful for that impact. Now the Chinese have commissioned a similar report for their own country. The US have not. I don't want to teach the US, but the Chinese, why do they do that? Why do they invite international scientists to give them the same lesson that Andy Stern gave to us? Because they want to find out how they can move ahead.
Before we take a final question in the back, and I apologize, I do want to make two quick comments. On our website, the New America Foundation, there is a talk by Mike Splinter, the CEO of Applied Materials, who himself, his company is getting into solar side, much of it in China, but also it's a sort of a backhanded critique of American policy negligence on industrial scale solar compared to what China and other countries are doing, which is a very interesting resource. And secondly, the last couple of days I've been hanging out with the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue with the Deputy Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, other folks from both sides of the aisle, frankly, in Australian politics. And it is impressive to see how Australia has absorbed the commitment to do high costs but, you know, important transition strategies on climate change, even though it recognizes that what it's really contributing is a template for approaching as opposed to really having a definitive effect on kind of, you know, global CO2 emissions. But I did want to give them a plug because it's been very impressive, and I hope some of them are watching right now. Yes, right here.
Yes, hi, my name is Suda, and I'm with the Congressional Study Group on Germany. I'd like you to leave aside China for a moment and talk about the role of legislators in this whole process. How are you going to assess sort of the run-up to the Copenhagen summit next year when there are major elections scheduled, of course, in the United States here, but also in India and Germany next year? Is the EU going to be able to be a firm negotiating partner next year when there are so many changes going on in some of these key playing countries for an agreement in Copenhagen next year?
So your question is really the legislative dynamics outside of China leading up to the Copenhagen summit.
Well, the major factor that is slowing down this whole negotiating process, as viewed from Europe, is the United States. At Bali, every American I could grab onto, I asked one question: are you going to move before the presidential election? And everybody told me the same answer: not before January next year. Is there going to be any relevant new development? And I guess it will take at least a couple of months for the new administration, whichever it would be, to set up their own agenda. So it's a very narrow time frame to get a result at the end of the year 2009 in Copenhagen. Compared to that, the European efforts, to me, seem ambitious. Now, I am critical, of course, of the effort that the German government is making. They have promised more than they implement right now. So are others dragging their feet. But by an international comparison, there is nobody but Europe that is willing to lead the way.
Reinhard, it is always such a pleasure to have you visit New American Foundation. You've been here many times. You've been a great friend, and every time you've taken on a different subject and hit the ball out of the park. I want to thank you very, very much for being with us. I want to thank the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and particularly my great friend Helga Flores Trejo. But thank you all for joining us. We'll stick with cardboard boxes in our lunches, particularly when Heinrich Böll is our partner. But thank you very much. Thanks, my friend.